special thanks, Ofir, to you. It's wonderful to have you join us. Right now, it's raining in Bloomington, where we are. I'm not sure what's doing in Tel Aviv, but I look forward to visiting your city before long, God willing, that will be, and saying hello to many friends and family there. Today's session with Ofir Winter couldn't be more pertinent. The question of normalization and its opposite, anti-normalization, is right smack at the center of the most serious discussions that take place involving Israel's relations with its neighboring countries. And we couldn't ask for a better spokesperson to address that question than Ofir Winter. Dr. Winter did his doctoral studies at Tel Aviv University, where he took his PhD in the Department of Middle Eastern and African History. He teaches courses on these subjects, both at Tel Aviv University and at Shalem College in Jerusalem. But as you can see from the backdrop to his presentation today, he's also associated with Israel's major think tank, the Institute for National Security Studies, arguably, in fact, the most important center of its kind, focusing on security studies in the Middle East. He recently was appointed the Alice and Paul Baker Senior Researcher at INSS. Ahadi Mazal Tov to you, Ofir, for that distinction. I myself first came across his research through a book that he did together with Uriya Shavit at Tel Aviv University on Zionism within Arab Discourses that was published in 2016. And to his credit, just this year, de Gruyter brought out his book, Peace in the Name of Allah, Islamic Discourses on Treaties with Israel. It's a very mixed discourse, as we'll hear from him. We're all aware of and excited by the promises held out by the Abraham Accords, at the same, which certainly goes far towards normalizing relations with Israel. At the same time, not too long ago, within Iraq, al-Sadr pronounced the death sentence on people normalizing relations with Israel. So it's a very contested issue. It's an issue vital, in fact, to peace and security in the Middle East, and it will be the focus of our guest's lecture today. Ofir, it's now my pleasure to hand over to you. We all look forward to hearing you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alvin Rosenfeld. I hope you can hear me well. And thank you also, Dr. Gunter Jabl, for inviting me to this webinar. It's a great opportunity, first of all, to join you from Israel, and then to discuss some insights from my new book, Peace in the Name of Allah, which was published just earlier this year. I will, if it's okay, I will try to share with you now my presentation. Do you see it well? Excellent. So the focus of my book, as Alvin mentioned, is how Arab regimes, particularly Egypt, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates, tried to prepare their own public opinions for peace and normalization agreements with Israel, and legitimize a relationship that has been perceived for many years as an illegitimate one. As you can mention, as you can imagine, and as you know, I guess, the regime faced fierce domestic opposition, especially by Islamist parties, and many of the objections for peace treaties and normalization with Israel, with the Jews, had an anti-Semitic tone. And the regime who defended these agreements had to counter these arguments on the same religious grounds. To be clear, my book doesn't claim that peace agreements with Israel or with the Jews are a result of Islamic religious considerations. Not at all. As we all know, each Arab regime, each Arab leader had his own realpolitik considerations, pragmatic ones, which we're quite familiar with when it comes to make peace with Israel. However, Islamic argumentations could help portray, as I will try to prove you, could help portray peace with the Jews not only as a beneficial political decision, but also as religiously moral one. And I think here is the importance of Islam in creating what some people define as a culture of peace and fighting anti-Semitism in Arab societies. Peace could be not just a forced marriage, but a voluntary decision that came probably, hopefully, from the heart. So let me open with some general word about peace in Islam, because I think it's important. Unlike what some tend to think, Islam itself, in its essence, is not against peace with Israel and the Jews, and not for peace with Israel and the Jews. Different Muslims rely on different Islamic sources from the Quran, from the tradition, in order to justify different opinions. And at times, these opinions are even contradictory. The Quran contains verses that preach peace as a supreme value, alongside verses that preach war against non-Muslims. The tradition, likewise, contains contrasting narratives, favoring peace and favoring war. And this diversity in the sources itself of the Muslims afford them a room to maneuver, to contemporary Muslims, by following some examples and disregarding others. The ambivalence of Islamic scriptures on issues of war or peace stems from historical circumstances in which the Quran and the tradition, the Hadith, were composed. The accepted distinction is the one that you can see here in my presentation between the Meccan period from the revelation until the hijrah of Muhammad to Medina, and the Madinian period from the hijrah until Muhammad's death. More peaceful verses are generally associated with the period of Muhammad's activity in Mecca, when Islam was beginning to grow up in a very hostile environment and lacked military power base. And for this reason, Muhammad had to do many concessions to the surrounding pagan majority society. Conversely, the verses of the Medinian period were revealed after the hijrah, when the community of Muslim believers had become a political military entity with both defensive and offensive capabilities and also ambitions of expansion. Addressing the question of how to decide between Meccan surahs and Medinian ones, or at least to reconcile the contradictions between them, is still a point of argument between different Muslim jurists, and maybe we can address this issue later on. As for the attitudes towards the Jews, Islamic sources can also be divided into two main periods: an earlier friendly period and the later more hostile one. The positive attitude towards the Jews in the early period is manifested in the choice for example, of Jerusalem as the first direction of prayer. It's what they call in Arabic Ula el-Qiblatain. Apparently, it was an attempt to attract the Jews of the Arabian Peninsula to the religion of Muhammad. Furthermore, early Quranic verses contain references to Jewish forefathers and even to God's promise of the Holy Land to the children of Israel, and some verses even refer to the Jews as, and also to the Christians, by the way, as what we all familiar with, people of the book. I guess you heard this notion. The friendly period in Islamic Jewish relations continued until shortly after the Hijrah, when the Prophet Muhammad and the people of Medina, including some of the city's Jewish tribes, signed a treaty which is known as the Constitution of Medina. This document set out the rights of the city's inhabitants, including security, freedom of worship, and mutual trade, as well as some duties, including recognizing Muhammad's status as the supreme authority in the city and defending the city with the Muslims against the enemies of the Muslims. The hostile period in relations between the Prophet himself and the Jews began after Muhammad realized that the Jewish tribes of Medina, although they were willing to sign treaties with him and even pleased by the prospect to spread monotheism, were unwilling to recognize his mission and join his new religion. The relations between both sides soured, and the treaties gradually crumbled, and it led to confrontation and to a very tragic fate for these Jewish tribes in Medina. The Hadith, the traditional literature, justifies attacks by Muslims on these Jewish tribes by claiming that they violated their treaties with the Muslims, allied against them, and even plotted to assassinate Prophet Muhammad. Similar accusations are also expressed in the Quran, which describes the Jews not only as the people that came from Israel, and even the land of Israel belongs to them, but also as violators of convents, killers of the prophets, and unbelievers who turned their back on God, cursed him, and he turned them, according to the Quran, to apes and pigs. Following the crisis in the relation between Muhammad and the Jewish tribes, Islam acted to differentiate itself from Judaism by changing some commandments that were borrowed from the Jewish faith. Of course, Friday became the holy day instead of Saturday. The direction of the prayer was changed from Jerusalem to the Kaaba in Mecca, and the Yom Kippur fast was replaced by the month of Ramadan, for example. So such historical ambivalence in the holy scripts creates ambiguity, constructive as well as destructive one, which is reflected in contemporary Islamic polemic also on peace with Israel and the Jews. To make my argument a little bit more concrete, I would like to share with you a personal experience I had in Bahrain last April. I attended with Professor Uriya Shavit that you just mentioned before, Alvin, a prayer for peace at the place, at the cathedral. Its name is Our Lady of Arabia, near Manama. And the event held under the patronage of the king himself, King Hamad. And one by one, local spiritual leaders representing different religions conveyed messages of coexistence in this ceremony. When the Muslim Imam spoke about Islam as a religion of peace, my smartphone broke up with some pushes with the news about a terror attack in the heart of Tel Aviv in Dizengoff by Islamists. So it was a very striking moment when both peaceful imam and the terrorists acted in the very same time in the name of Islam. And I want us to hear the Jewish speaker at the event, Abraham Nunu. He was a former member of the upper house of the Bahraini parliament. When one seat is reserved for Jews, I hope you will be able to hear it.
Elohe avivarmenu, Adonai Ishmalha, Adonai Shemo, Wamru, Amen. Thank you.
So the main opponents of peace treaties with Israel in all the Arab countries, yes, that made peace with Israel, are Islamist forces, mainly the Muslim Brotherhood. And each country has its own branches and offsprings of this movement. I have to say, because we are here in this context of anti-Semitism, not all of their arguments against peace with Israel are anti-Semitic ones. For example, they regard Palestine as part of the Islamic Ummah, Islamic nation, the caliphate that should be reunited in the future according to their vision. And they refuse to recognize Israel as a permanent political entity. Yet, unfortunately, I have to say that many Islamist writings are also bluntly anti-Semitic. Based on selected Quranic verses and hadiths, you can see one example here. They portray Jews as the historic enemies of Muslims since the time of the Prophet until today, enemies of humanity and enemies of Islam. Moreover, many conspiracies are attributed by Islamists to Jews to control the world, to dominate the Muslim societies, to corrupt them. Jews are perceived very regularly as unacceptable partners for peace due to their alleged negative inherent characteristics, including cruelty, miserliness, treachery, violation of contracts. Such prevalent anti-Semitic sentiments in Muslim societies are, of course, a huge challenge in the face of any paradigmatic change or shift towards peace with Israel and the Jews. I would like to share with you several short examples of Islamist anti-Semitic approaches. And let's start, of course, naturally with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Its mouthpiece was Al-Da'wa, a monthly magazine at the time. And following Sadat's historical visit to Jerusalem in November 1977, the magazine stressed that the Jewish enemies' demonic nature doesn't enable this peace doesn't enable them to support this peace agreement or this peace initiative. In December, its editorial urged the readers and maybe also Sadat himself to remember the nature of the Jews, and I quote, as described in the Quran, namely that they are contract breakers, the bitter enemies of the believers. Al-Da'wa also published an article that was titled "The Jews' Nature Prevents Them from Living in Peace with the Others," and the article presented the author's insights about the Jews based on Hitler's Mein Kampf and based on the Quran, which, and I quote, preceded Hitler by 1,400 years. The author assessed that the coming period of normalization with Israel would be the most dangerous period in Egypt's history. The Muslim Brotherhood also warned of a dangerous Jewish invasion to Egypt's economic, cultural, moral, social, and religious life under the banner of peace. Let's move now to the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, the country who made peace with Israel, the second country who made peace with Israel in 1994. And central to their criticism was the issue of normalization, not only peace, also normalization, because unlike the Egyptian regime, which we preferred, as we know, a cold peace with Israel, the Jordanian monarchy encouraged joint projects with Israel in the spheres of economy, culture, even art. The Muslim Brotherhood opposed the King Hussein's attempts to legitimize good relations with the Jews and highlighted the distinction made in the Quran between the children of Israel, whom Allah favored, and the Jews, who are described in the Quran as infidels, aggressors, oppressors, murderers, and criminals. An article in their own mouthpiece, his name is El-Sabil, explained that anyone who referred to the Jewish state as Israel was accepting the false attempt to remove the psychological barrier that rightfully separates the Islamic nation from the Jews. And this is a direct quotation from the article. The prophet, you can see it, peace and prayer upon him, called them the descendants of the apes and swine, not our cousins or the fellow children of Abraham. As we will see very shortly, this was a direct criticism of King Hussein's call to Jews, the children of Abraham. I jump now to the Abraham Accords of 2020, between, first of all, the first country was the United Arab Emirates, and the Emirati Islamist dissident, Said al-Tunaiji. He is a co-founder of the Muslim Brotherhood's party in the UAE, al-Islah, and the co-founder of the Emirati Association Against Normalization. He is now in exile. He wondered how the normalizers could trust the Jews, the killers of the prophets, and make peace with people whose history, according to what he wrote, is based on aggression against the prophets and all the nations of the world. In an article he authored, al-Tunaiji called the Jews the enemies of the believers and listed the massacres that attributed to them and to modern Israel, which he claimed reflect their barbaric doctrine that designates the Jews as the chosen people and all others as no more than animals. According to al-Tunaiji, the Jews do not direct their animosity only to the Palestinians, but to the entire world, according to what is written in the Quran. So, as I show in my book, the agreements with Israel were accompanied by a heated religious polemic between the regimes and their state Islam affiliated official institutions from one side, and the opponents of peace with Israel, mainly, as I said, the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood affiliates from the other side. Arab regimes used different Islamic justifications, which I discuss in my book, for peace with Israel, including presenting Islam as a religion of peace, highlighting the agreement's contribution to promotion of the principal objective of the Sharia, validating some precedents from the time of the Prophet, particularly, maybe you heard about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, as an example for contemporary Muslims' inclinations towards peace with Israel. And the last main argument, which I try to focus in this presentation, is the conceptualization of Jews as appropriate and legitimate partners for peace with the Muslims, unlike the Islamist anti-Semitic approach that we just saw. So let's see several examples. I will start again with Egypt and Sadat and his famous address to the Israeli Knesset exactly 45 years ago, which highlighted during this address the close connection between Judaism and Islam. In his closing statement, he quoted a Quranic verse which recognizes the Jewish prophets. You can see it here in the presentation. Later on, during the peace talks, Sadat even proposed, maybe some of you remember, the establishing of a spiritual center for members of the three monotheistic faiths on Mount Sinai, Jabl Musa in Arabic, where a synagogue, a mosque, and a church would be built side by side and serve as a symbol of peace and brotherhood among the Abrahamic religions. As you may imagine, the Muslim Brotherhood didn't welcome this initiative. An article in Al-Da'wa magazine claimed that such a center is against the directions or directives of the Quran, as Muslims may not allow a church and a synagogue to be placed on the same level as a mosque. The initiative died. The initiative to build this spiritual center died, unfortunately, with Sadat, which was assassinated in October 81. But we will come back to his initiative very soon when we speak of the United Arab Emirates. Historical precedent mentioned in the polemic over peace was the Constitution of Medina, signed, as I told before, by Muhammad and some of the Jewish tribes of the city. Both sides, the regime and the Islamists, accepted the traditional Islamic narrative that the Jewish tribes pledged to accept Muhammad as the supreme authority of Medina, helped the Muslims to defend it and avoid alliances with idolaters in exchange for Muslim recognition of their religion and a promise to defend them and their property. Likewise, both sides, Islamists and the regime, accepted that the Jewish tribes later violated the constitution when they allied with the Quraysh tribe against the Muslims. So where was the controversy, or where is the controversy between both sides? It centered around the lesson to be derived from the Constitution of Medina. The regime spokesman emphasized the period of reconciliation between the Prophet and the Jews, while Islamists focused on the break of their relations. For example, you can see here the Egyptian Mufti Gad al-Haq declared, the Egyptian Mufti, of course, he was affiliated with the regime, with Sadat, and he declared that the Prophet's life provided a proof of his inclination to make peace with non-Muslims, and that his first peace treaty, the first peace treaty that was ever made by Prophet Muhammad, was particularly with the Jews. Even more so, in a possible attempt to grant legitimacy to direct normalization between Egypt and Israel in contemporary times, he also noted that under the Constitution of Medina, Muslims and Jews enjoyed excellent trade relations that contributed to their economic prosperity. The Muslim Brotherhood, on the other hand, focused on the battles that erupted between Muhammad and the Jewish tribes after the collapse of this constitution, and saw this as a proof of the animosity that prevailed between Muslim and Jews since earliest days of Islam. And the charter's violation was presented by Islamists as another evidence for the Jews' unreliability as partners for peace. Last slide about Egypt. Long before the recent Abraham Accord, Sadat called Jews cousins and even fellow sons of Abraham. In 1979, one of Sadat's main spokesmen and biographer, Abdel Munim Shamis, he wrote kind of a pamphlet of propaganda in favor of peace with Israel, where he explained that peace with Israel was not an acceptance of Zionism, but rather a preservation of the coexistence that used to exist between Muslim and Jews, sons of Abraham, in Egypt and the rest of the region. While Muslim Brotherhood, as we mentioned, regarded the Jews as historical enemies, Shamis and also Sadat tried to portray them as historic neighbors. And Shamis even hinted at a deeper insight, namely that recognizing the Jews as a religious minority that lived peacefully among its Muslim neighbors for centuries in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere in the Middle East, enabled Israel to be viewed more positively, also today, as a kind of a reincarnation of the historical Jewish presence in the region, which had always been an organic and legitimate part of its fabric, neither alien or threatening towards its neighbors, unlike what we heard that the Islamists assumed. As Shamis put it in this beautiful quotation from his propaganda booklet, Jews had a neighborhood in Cairo and a neighborhood in Damascus, and now they came to have a large neighborhood in Israel. So this is also another way to portray the historical narrative of Israel and its neighbors, Jews and their fellow Muslims. Hussein's path to legitimizing peace with Israel was smoother than his Egyptian counterpart. The taboo against signing peace agreement with Israel was already broken by Egypt 15 years ago. And Syrians and Palestinians were already participated in the Madrid conference and joined the peace process. Despite this, also in Jordan, especially the Jordanian public opinion, at least half of it are Palestinians in origin, and the Muslim Brotherhood was and still is a significant part and influential factor. The transition from conflict to peace with Israel was not easy at all. In addition, as mentioned, Jordan looked for a warmer and broader peace and economic cooperation with Israel. And the challenge was not just to legitimize the basic act of making peace, but also the forging of peaceful ties in many diverse aspects of normalization. This is why the attempt to revive positive aspects of the historical relations between Muslims and Jews, which was rather marginal in the Egyptian peace discourse, played a much more central role in the peace rhetoric of the Jordanian regime. King Hussein believed that in order to translate the warm peace policy he wanted with Israel into facts on the ground, it was essential to foster warmer relations between the two peoples. And to this end, he advanced the narrative that peace with the Jews is a renewal of the fraternity between the two religions that were born in the same geographical area, share common roots, and similar religious cultural heritage, and have a long history of friendly relations, which should be restored. The metaphor that was most prominently used by the Jordanian king was the children of Abraham, implying that peace between Jordan and Israel revived these ancient blood ties between two brothers, two sons of a single forefather. The phrase children of Abraham appeared in many of Hussein's speeches. For example, at the signing ceremony of the peace treaty in the Arava crossing border, the king said that all children of Abraham, and he mentioned the Jordanians, the Israelis, the Palestinians, would remember that moment as a new era, a dawning of a new era of peace, mutual respect, tolerance, and coming together of different people. And according to this metaphor of children of Abraham, instead of historical rivals, Jews and Muslims can see themselves as cousins who quarreled, indeed, but can reconcile and restore their original fraternal relations. In the picture here, you may see a postal stamp commemorates King Hussein 1 year after he died, and his peaceful message. Now let's go back to the Abraham Accords between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Do you remember the first time that this name, the Abraham Accords, was announced? It was a press conference on August 13th in the Oval Office when President Trump asked the US ambassador in Jerusalem at the time, David Friedman, to explain the meaning of this name. And the ambassador said that, of course, he was a little bit embarrassed from this mission, but he said that Abraham was the father of the three monotheistic faiths, and no figure better symbolizes than him the potential for unity among both religions. And Trump remarked in response, perhaps mocking, perhaps not, you can't know with Trump, that he wanted to name the agreement after himself, but he had refrained for fear of the reaction of the American press. What is important, I think, that the name of the agreements reflected very well that the architects of this agreement were aware of the importance of constructing a new narrative that would portray Muslim and Jews as relatives rather than historical rivals, because the narrative is also important. As you can see here, the agreement articulates even the text of the agreement itself articulates the recognition of the Arab and Jewish peoples as the descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham, and so on and so forth. Following the signing of the Abraham Accords in September 2020, which was the official signing, and the Emirati authorities also showed an increased inclination, which is rather uncommon in Arab countries, to recognize the Holocaust. A reflection of this was the opening, I'm sure you heard about it, the opening in 2021 of a Holocaust memorial exhibition in the Crossroad of Civilization Museum in Dubai, featuring some historical texts on the persecution of European Jews by the Nazis, photographs and exhibits commemorating the 1.5 million children killed in the Holocaust, including the story of Anna Frank, and some personal testimonies of Holocaust survivors who managed to build their new lives in Israel and other countries. The exhibition also pays a special tribute to Muslims who saved Jews during the Holocaust. For example, Egyptian one, Hilmi, which is very famous one. In a corner, of the exhibition, you can see the board here, bearing the Quranic verse. I know it also exists in the Bible. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire, in both the Arabic and English. Another board, which is not in the picture, presents statements made by the Emirati Foreign Minister, Abdallah Ben Zayed, on a joint visit with his Israeli counterpart to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, where the minister identified with the victims of Nazism. In the museum courtyard, outside, there is a large, colorful drawing created jointly by Israeli and Emirati artists. It shows two young men, an Emirati and an Israeli, chatting, probably drinking together from a traditional coffee pot against the backdrop of the view of Dubai sunset. Above them is the word cousins in Arabic and Hebrew, grandsons of Abraham. The museum's founder, a very interesting and impressive person, his name is Ahmed Ubaid al-Mansouri. He served before as a parliament member, and he established this museum in a building that was provided by the authorities back in 2013. Most of the items, including the Jewish items that are exhibited, are from his personal collection. And the museum target audience includes tourists and also local school children, local Emirati school children. I visited the place, I think it was May 2021, and he told me that he himself ascribes a great importance to the joint historical roots of Muslim Jews and Christians, and seeks to present this peaceful, conciliatory narrative in his museum. This exhibition is the first of its kind in the Arab world, and it's groundbreaking, I think, in several respects. First, it replaces the common Holocaust denial that prevails in many Arab societies with recognition. Second, it offers an alternative approach of empathy instead of the prevailing zero-sum game dynamics of competitive victimhood between the Israeli and Palestinians national narratives. And third, it paves the way, I think, for a kind of a new form of intercultural interactions between Muslim and Jews based on the historical evidence, not based on conspiracies. The Emirati peace rhetoric differed considerably, I must say, from the Egyptian and the Jordanian ones. The first difference had to do with the character of the internal opposition to the peace agreement. The Emirati regime had the benefit of a relatively quiet domestic arena. There are no Muslim Brotherhood today in the UAE. Moreover, the Emirati campaign for peace with Israel and the Jews was grounded in religious ideological infrastructure already tempered by a moderate Islamic discourse of tolerance towards other religions, especially Jews and Christians, which formed a basis of culture of peace, for culture of peace. And this discourse is not new to the UAE. It began following the 9/11 in 2003, 2001, 2003, and already in 2019, during the events of the Year of Tolerance in the UAE, the Emirate announced an initiative to build the Abrahamic family house in Abu Dhabi, which is, it will be familiar for you, it's a joint religious complex including a mosque, a church, and a synagogue, very similar to the one that Sadat planned to build on Mount Sinai. how you can see here how it should look like, and the three houses of worship are expected at least to be completed by the end of this year. Such an emphasis on fostering dialogue and coexistence among the Abrahamic faiths, including Judaism and Islam, have precedented the peace treaty and presented the Emirati public opinion as part of a wider national heritage of religious tolerance, and not only related to the Abraham Accords. In the same spirit, following the Abraham Accord, Jews are portrayed by the regime and by affiliated clerics as legitimate and desirable partners for agreements with the Muslims, since they are fellow descendants of Abraham, and also based on the precedent that we mentioned before, the Constitution of Medina between Muhammad and the Jews. So I think this discourse of tolerance was promoted it was not meant to prepare the ground specifically for the Abraham Accords, but however it laid down a religious infrastructure that facilitated the promotion of the agreement and the acceptance by the Emirati public. Approaching to the end of my presentation, it's important to know that religious polemic continues even nowadays. As you all know, each narrative has a counter narrative. The Abraham Accords awakened many conspiracy theories in the Arab world. The most popular one, which combined with some anti-Semitic arguments, suggested a kind of a Jewish Zionist American plot to create a new religion called Abrahamic, which would harm Islam. This conspiracy theory developed as a response to the UAE decision to establish the Abrahamic family house in Abu Dhabi that I just mentioned. And the conspiracy is surfaced in many fatwas, articles, even several books. You may see on your left one of these books. Another active player, not a passive one, in the polemic is Israel, who worked to foster peaceful religious narratives in the Arab world. This cartoon was published only last month on the Arabic Twitter account of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It asks in Arabic, how does our father Abraham, or Ibrahim in Arabic, yes, see the peace between the cousins? And the answer comes from the biblical verse, and you shall be father of many nations, and kings shall come out of thee. So you see that Israel also tried to encourage this kind of narratives, and seems to understand the appeal of such a religious discourse for some Arab Muslims and probably some Arab Christian audiences as well. Finally, one should ask how effective were these religious messages in achieving their main goal, namely legitimizing or delegitimizing peace with Israel and the Jews. So it's not easy to conduct a reliable public opinion surveys in non-democratic Arab states. Yet, let me share with you some findings. In June 2020, about 2 months before the announcement of the Abraham Accords, the proportion of Emiratis favoring normalization with Israelis was only 14%. In October that year, so it means 1 month after the signing of the agreement and 2 months after their announcement, this figure rose to 39%. The survey was conducted, by the way, by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. These results reflect, I think, the magnitude of the challenge faced by the Emirati regime. very small numbers supported normalization with Israel when it initially came to market this initiative to its citizens, but also its success, or at least partial success, in increasing the level of support for its yet very contested policy. I think that if there was indeed significant shift in the public opinion in favor of the agreement, the regime's religious arguments that were in the center may have had a part in affecting this change. By the way, similar findings were evident at the time also in Egypt and Jordan about the positive changes. So, Gunther, I think I will stop here and maybe open the stage for hopefully for your comments, for your questions. So thank you very much.